Hello and welcome. In this video we're going to create the instrument you just heard, using only stock plugins in Ableton Live 12. This instrument is centered around the Arpeggiator and Drift, and also using delays in a way you might not have used them before. If you want to recreate this exactly, you're going to need the following instruments and effects: Arpeggiator and Drift as the source, multiband compressor, 2 glue compressors, chorus ensemble, EQs and delays, spectral resonator, grain delay, reverb, and a mid-side EQ as well. This is the instrument in its entirety. I'm just going to turn the effects off and the Arpeggiator to start, so we can just listen to what the Drift sounds like. As you can see, I've used a chord as the input. It has 8 notes in it, but that will become more apparent as we get to the Arpeggiator as to why I've done that. Drift is a fun little instrument. I haven't used it that much, but it's definitely worth getting to grips with. It has 2 oscillators, a noise generator, filter envelopes, and ability to LFO and mod things. With this I'm mainly using oscillator 1 with the 4th shape, set to a value of 0.31 and the octave at -1, the level at -6 decibels. Oscillator 2 I've set to a sawtooth and brought the level all the way down to -24 decibels, and the noise is also very quiet at -42 decibels as well. The next thing I did to really impact the sound was with the filter. I set it to type 2 with the frequency at 346 Hz, and then used the envelope to shape it, brought the sustain all the way down to 17%, and the decay to 394 milliseconds. This is really useful for when we start to arpeggiate the sound, because obviously when we hear it just as the chord, you can hear it, obviously it starts with that bright sound and then comes all the way down. But when we introduce the Arpeggiator, this filter will really start to shape the sound. I haven't really done much else with Drift, but as a stock plugin, I would really recommend that you start playing around with it, see what kind of sound you can get out of it. Next we'll move to the Arpeggiator. Now it's quite simple what I've done here. I changed the style to converge and diverge. So that basically means the notes will start from the highest and lowest points and converge to the middle, and then diverge back outwards to the highest and lowest points. I set the rate to 1/16 and the gate to 80%. Let's listen to that. Now the reason why I used 8 notes in each chord input was to make sure that the Arpeggiator converged and diverged with 4 notes each. I wanted to keep the movement of the Arpeggiator as symmetrical as possible. If you use a different number of notes, you're going to get a different pattern. Next we'll start moving to the effects. First I introduced an OTT, mainly just to work on the mids and the highs a little bit more. I increased the time amount to 249% and then brought the amount down to 53%. This is what it sounds like with that. As you can hear, it just gives the sound a little bit more presence. Next I had a glue compressor, bringing the threshold down and the makeup gain up a little bit, with soft clip turned on, again just to give it a little bit more punch. Next we move to the chorus ensemble. I've set it to vibrato mode and set the amount to 21% and the rate to 0.4 Hz. This is to basically give it that 80s kind of pitch drift kind of sound, again to go along with the synth name Drift as well. This is a very subtle effect. I'll increase the amount so you can really hear what's happening. But with me going for something that's sort of like a synthwavey 80s style sound, I wanted to introduce this chorus ensemble just to give it that kind of pitch drift that you would get in the older synth type sound. I also increased the warmth to 0.7%. If you're wondering what this is doing, it's adding a little bit of saturation and filtering out the top end a little bit. The next bit we're going to get to is quite complex. This is our stereo delay moment, and this is a way that you might not have used delays before, but can be really fun to experiment with. So I've set all of this up in an effects rack. Basically I have 8 chains, and these are split into different bands of frequencies with an EQ on each one. The lowest band I've set a low pass filter to 110 Hz, and the highest band I've set a high pass filter at 7040 Hz. I didn't really want to do much delaying in these areas, especially in the lows, and that will become more apparent as we get to the mid-side EQ later on. I kept the panning of the low and the high chain in the centre, The next band are set to 110 to 220 Hz, and as you can see in the EQ here, I'm using a high pass and a low pass filter to notch out that band. I then pan this all the way to the left. In the next band, I set that to 220 to 440 Hz and pan that all the way to the right, as you can see with the EQ and the panning here. And if you're familiar with frequency and pitch, 440 Hz is concert A. So I split all of these bands into octaves from A1 to A2, A2 to A3, next one A3 to A4, A4 to A5 and so on. So we have 440 to 880 Hz, 880 to 1760 Hz, 1760 to 3520 Hz, and then 3520 Hz to 7040 Hz. And as you can see, each one is panned to the opposite of the other one. So we have left and right, left and right, left and right. If we go back to the first band, 110 to 220 Hz, after the EQ, I've added a delay. So this delay is only being activated by this band of frequencies from the EQ before. If you put the delay before the EQ, it's going to delay all of the frequencies from the input sound. Whereas instead, I just wanted to delay that band. I set the timing of this delay to 3 and brought the feedback all the way down to 12. As we go through the bands, you'll notice the feedback gets higher. I didn't want to have massive amounts of delay in the low end, but as we get through the mids into the highs, I wanted to increase the amount of feedback that was happening in the delay. In the next band, 220 to 440 Hz, as you can see, I brought the feedback up to 15% and changed the time to 4. In the next band, the feedback is at 20% and the time is at 6. And I wanted to have different timing amounts for each band as it went through, just to create a little bit of a interesting delay set instead of having one delay for all of the sound. The next band, 25% feedback, and I set the time to 5. In the next band, feedback to 30%, brought the time back to 3, and in the final band with the delay, set the feedback to 50% and the time to 2. What I'll do now is I'll go through and I'll solo each band individually and then we'll play it all back together. As you can hear, this gives quite an interesting delay effect. It's not just your standard ping pong effect that you would have in a delay, as you can press this ping pong button here, which basically moves the sound from left to right. I'm forcing this into very specific bands that I've set, and then obviously each delay has its own timing and feedback amount as well. Just a little way of thinking outside of the box when it comes to a way of using delays that you might not have before. Now in Ableton Live there is a plugin called Filter Delay which does this, but it only has 3 bands. Technically you could stack these if you wanted to, but I feel like this gives you a lot more control, especially with the bands and the amount that you want to set each delay to. The next effect rack we're going to move to is a combination of Spectral Resonator and a dry signal out. So I've just set up 2 chains here. The dry signal has no effects on it, whereas the Spectral Resonator has a Spectral Resonator and an EQ. And I've taken the MIDI from the input signal of this channel, and I've also set the signal to pre-effects as well, because I only wanted the drift to be affecting the sound of this, rather than any other effects after the drift. I set the Spectral Resonator to granular, transposed it up 12 semitones with a decay of 550 milliseconds, dampened the high frequencies and low frequencies a little bit, stretched out the harmonics minus 100%, and then shifted the whole thing 12 semitones. This is what this sounds like by itself. Now I find granular quite a fun little sound to play with, but I was noticing this was getting a little bit too screechy in the high mids. So I introduced an EQ8 and pulled out all of the lows, just to shape the highs as well a little bit, just to make sure that this wasn't overwhelming the sound too much. And if we introduce the other chain without any effects on it, this is what the 2 chains combined sound like. After that I added a grain delay, which I went into detail in the last video, set the spray to 210 milliseconds, brought the frequency all the way down and the pitch all the way up. and I set the feedback to 18% and the dry wet to 17%. And this is just again to add that sort of pitch movement in delay form. After that I added a reverb just to sort of wash the whole thing together, setting a decay of 3.16 seconds, bringing in a low shelf so I wasn't having too much reverb in the low end. Density to high and a dry wet of 36%. After this, an EQ8, where I'm notching the mids and bringing a little bit more presence with a high shelf in the top end. Also, when I was checking this through a stereo meter, I was noticing I was getting a little bit of phase cancellation where the correlation meter was moving into negative phase. So I introduced a mid-side EQ and really notched out the mids in that side portion just to bring in the sound so it was less over phasing out with itself. And then to finish off the sound, I introduced a glue compressor as well. And this is what it sounds like altogether. Again, just before we finish, you don't have to use Drift or an Arpeggiator even with this effects rack. I've actually split this out where it's a full instrument rack and the effects rack itself. And I did this with another channel where I introduced a Vital. It's a very simple patch this as well. All it is basically a sawtooth, and I've just reduced the top end a little bit with a filter, but I've kept the same effects that I did in the sound that you just heard. And this is what that sounds like. Again, if I take the effects off, it's very simple. But with the effects, it sounds like this. As I said in the last video, the thesis of this, again, I just wanted to show how much you can do with free and stock plugins. You don't have to go out and spend a massive amount of money to get something that sounds really, really cool. Really, this is all about experimentation and following the creative journey, see where it takes you. Using plugins in a way that you might not have thought about using them, as we saw with the delay chain that I did. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed this video. As always, until next time, God bless and goodbye.